Greetings, it's Emperor Jabari. Welcome to the Empire. Throughout world history, the domestication and subsequent use of the horse was one of the most significant events to have ever taken place. Horses revolutionized trade, transport, and warfare throughout Africa, Asia, and Europe. Even after their arrival in the New World, they were quickly adopted by indigenous peoples in the centuries that followed, and were utilized to great effect, most famously by the Plains tribes of the West, an iconic sight in American history, or the popular images of the so-called cowboys and Indians. From the rise of the early civilizations, and as recently as the 20th century, horses have always been a prominent feature in many of the world's civilizations. Even today, the most popular measure of an engine is measured in horsepower. The largest contiguous empire in history was built around a core of elite cavalry units, the Mongols, and many more of the world's largest empires prior to the age of exploration were consistently overrepresented by armies primarily composed of cavalry, including the Huns, Mamluks, and Seljuks. Africa's largest empires were consistently carved out by horse-riding warriors including Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and the largest Yoruba state in the history of the Yoruba people reached its size and strength through the effective use of cavalry, the only Yoruba kingdom to ever adopt horses for military purposes. However, horses could really only thrive in the grasslands of Africa, where they were relatively safe from the primarily forest-dwelling tsetse fly, a biting insect that is the vector of trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, deadly to horses. This severely limited their spread and usage throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and made them exceedingly expensive and difficult to maintain in any large numbers. However, Africa is home to its own indigenous equine species that are perfectly evolved to live on the African continent and are resistant to trypanosomiasis. So, why haven't we encountered armies of zebra-riding archers dominating the Sahel of Africa, as did the horse-riding nomads of the Eurasian steppe and the American West? Why ignore these native horse-like creatures and choose to instead import foreign, expensive animals from distant lands all the way across a desert larger than the entirety of the United States? For many people, this seems like an obvious oversight on the part of Africans. Rather than having the skills, patience, or perseverance to domesticate the local animals, they simply imported a foreign species from a foreign land that had already been domesticated by foreign people thousands of years prior. If this is your line of thinking, it's important to first have a true understanding of what exactly domestication is, as the definition frequently gets mixed up with taming, which is a different process entirely. Taming is simply the process of capturing a wild animal, training it, and conditioning it to live somewhat comfortably and respectably among humans. Even if the animal lives perfectly peacefully among humans for several years, including one that was raised in captivity from birth, it is still only considered to be a wild animal that has merely been tamed. This is because despite being able to live among humans, it is still a wild animal retaining its wild instincts and carrying on the traits and behaviors, physical attributes, and temperaments that are perfectly adapted for life in the wild rather than a life alongside human beings. An animal only becomes truly domesticated when it has been selectively bred in captivity over many generations until it exhibits unique traits that make it clearly and obviously distinct from its wild ancestors, that make it more favorable for human life, a process that is purposefully conducted by its human masters over thousands of years. More on this later. In prehistoric times, animals deemed suitable for domestication exhibited a few universal traits. Charles Darwin, widely considered to be the father of the theory of evolution, was among the first great thinkers of the past to propose this in his publication, The Origin of Species. Let's go over these traits, and later, we'll see just where zebras fit into the grand scheme of things. Social structure. Humans are social animals, and like humans, most other social animals have a natural sense of hierarchy, and as a result, they are easier to control and manipulate. This is why a herdsman can guide his cattle with ease, because in nature, they would have been guided by the bull. He can exploit this dynamic by creating pressure in the form of a whip, a fence, or loud sounds, or positive reinforcement in the form of food and water to lead the herd. If he controls the bull, he controls the herd. Sexual behavior. animals that are comfortable and capable of breeding under artificial conditions in human society, promiscuous animals with very short, obvious, and predictable breeding seasons and reproductive cycles, as well as fast maturity rates conducive to cheap and efficient care and maintenance to build a stockpile of livestock. Hence the name livestock, literally meaning stock as one would view stock in a store, but living. Parent-young interactions. For social animals, the parent-child bond is one of the most powerful and long-lasting attachments that an animal can possibly have, an instinctive behavior where the offspring becomes inseparable, and this can be directly translated to human beings, ultimately resulting in animals that are more loyal and trusting of humans for life. Feeding behavior and habitat choice. If an animal's diet or habitat is too extreme, then it would not be easy for its human caretakers to maintain. A pet lion, for example. Let's ignore the obvious reasons why this would be a terrible idea, as we'll cover that in the next section. But regarding this category alone, lions would still make a poor choice. An adult male lion needs at least 19 pounds of flesh per day and can eat up to 100 pounds in just one sitting. It would also need a vast open savanna to roam. Neither of these would be easy to accommodate, nor would they be worth the obvious risks. Responses to humans. Lastly, an animal's behavior around humans is perhaps the single most important factor. Animals that are too easily spooked by humans will be notoriously difficult to capture or care for, as they will react more quickly with fight or flight. Flight would do no good, and fight would result in injury or death on either side. The overwhelming majority of all of Earth's creatures fit firmly within this fight or flight category, opting to immediately run away or attack if threatened or cornered. I know that ads can get pretty annoying and repetitive, but please hear me out. It's been quite a few years since I've been using Happy Hippo products, and I can confidently say that their traditional medicine has changed my life. They help me remain focused and energized, help with my anxiety, and put me in a generally good mood. I've recommended them to my friends and family with nothing but positive results, and that is why I recommend them to you and anyone else who can benefit from them. In fact, they even have a few types of African traditional medicine as well, like akuama and kana. You can get a 10% discount on your entire order site-wide if you use my promo code FN10 at checkout at happyhippo.com. With all of today's scientific breakthroughs and mechanical devices, we can control nearly any animal that we so choose. It's as simple as a tranquilizer gun and a mechanical cage made of industrial-grade steel. However, for the sake of this topic, it is crucial that we approach it through the lens of hunter-gatherers with nothing but Stone Age tools living in small clans. In societies like these, human life was full of danger, and choosing between killing an animal or keeping it alive would have had everything to do with the benefits and the risks, and whether or not it was better to just kill it for food instead. Let's use the lion example again. Keeping a live lion around would have been a huge liability, full of risk and danger. It would require unfeasible amounts of animal flesh to keep it fed every single day, enough flesh to feed 10 people or more. It simply would not be worth the cost or risk to keep a live lion around and breed it, as well as feeding its pregnant mate and continuing to do so over several generations to a point of domestication under prehistoric conditions. And before you say anything, I get it. A lion is an extreme example. Lions are large, scary, and vicious predators, but horses aren't. And zebras are just striped horses, right? Well, no, not really. While it's true that zebras and horses both belong to the equine genus, they are distinct species. In fact, while humans and chimps have a similar amount of chromosomes, humans having 46 and chimpanzees having 48, the difference is more dramatic between horses and zebras, horses having 64, while zebras can have anywhere between just 32 and up to 64, depending on the species. With that being said, they are quite different from horses on a deep genetic, biological, and behavioral level. Some species are more similar to horses, like the plain zebra, which is deemed the most horse-like, but much smaller. Or they can be more akin to a donkey or mule, like the Grevy zebra, which despite being more similar to a donkey in appearance, it holds the title as the largest of all zebra species, being comparable in size to a typical horse, and is easily recognizable by its very narrow and more tightly packed stripes, in comparison to the plains or mountain zebra, which have the thicker and more iconic stripes. All animals start off wild, and no animal fits perfectly into all 5 of the requirements that we mentioned before. However, ones that fit into the most of these categories while providing a clear and obvious benefit to humans would have been the better candidates. Take wolves for example. They can eat a semi-omnivorous diet, have an acute sense of hearing and smell, speed, and endurance. They are highly intelligent and efficient hunters. They are very loyal and care for their injured and elderly, and they mate for life. These are all qualities that give them a social structure that is very similar to many human societies. They also have predictable annual breeding seasons and give birth to several pups at once, which all mature within just 1 to 2 years of birth. These are all traits that would have been beneficial to early human hunter-gatherers with minimal risks of resource expenditure. While most wolves reacted similarly to other wild animals, fleeing or displaying aggression in the presence of humans, some would have been more curious and submissive. These would have been the ones that were tamed by early man and bred, thus producing more curious and obedient offspring. Other traits like size, speed, stamina, loyalty, sense of smell, and density of fur would have been favorable to prehistoric humans. They would have purposely bred wolves that exhibited these traits, depending on the environment that they lived in and what was most beneficial to their collective survival or their unique circumstances. Another important thing to keep in mind is that sub-Saharan Africans had already recognized the benefits of equine species. In fact, they had already domesticated one independently. That's right. While it's generally accepted that horses were initially domesticated on the Central Eurasian steppes around 5,000 years ago, a completely independent domestication event for the African wild ass occurred in sub-Saharan Africa, with the earliest evidence indicating that it occurred in either Sudan, Ethiopia, or Kenya. Genetic and archaeological evidence confirm that all modern-day donkeys descended from the African wild ass roughly 7,000 years ago, although exact specimens are difficult to identify. This is due to the fact that the earliest animals to be domesticated would have been genetically similar or virtually identical to their wild counterparts. It is believed that prehistoric Northeast Africans domesticated the donkey as a direct response to the drying of the Sahara around 6000 BCE. Prior to this great drying event, Africa was in what is known as the African Humid Period, or Green Sahara, and the vast and scorching desert that we're familiar with today would have been covered with vast grasslands and massive lakes and river systems. However, this was changing rapidly, and its inhabitants would have been increasingly mobile to search for food and water sources. Donkeys would have been the prime candidate for this, as they are very strong and hardy pack animals adapted to the relatively dry conditions. Neither horse nor zebra could fulfill this role in such a climate, as they both required massive quantities of water every single day. The only other animal in history that would have been capable of fulfilling the role of the donkey in these increasingly arid regions was the camel, which is an Asian animal that didn't even inhabit the African continent at all during this time in history. Historians debate when the camel was first domesticated, with some claiming it as recently as the 2nd century CE, while others claim a date as early as 2500 BCE. Regardless of either of these claims, camel domestication would have still taken place a full 3,000 years after the donkey. It would have taken even longer to enter widespread use in Africa, and those using the famous trans-Saharan camel caravans would have been the single-humped species, which suffer from severe health problems in wetter regions, which would have limited their use to places like the Sahara Desert and the Sahel only. So frankly, the domestication of the donkey predates both horses and camels. With all of that being said, Africans south of the Sahara clearly saw the benefits of equids and other large animals, and they had the means, the motive, and the capabilities to capture and eventually domesticate them. Africa's largest and most powerful civilizations were built from a strong, horse-driven military foundation, like the Mali Empire, which was recorded to have an army of around 100,000 soldiers, 10,000 of which were cavalry. The Oyo Empire, mentioned earlier, was built entirely around a core of semi-professional horse-riding warriors known as Eso, which would have been comparable to a European knight or Japanese samurai. This core of cavalry warriors was the primary component of the Oyo army and was directly responsible for the empire's success in wars. However, as mentioned earlier, the horse was extremely vulnerable to the fatal sleeping sickness or African trypanosomiasis, so with the many large and successful empires well versed in the use of horses and the domestication of the donkey taking place in sub-Saharan Africa thousands of years before even the horse or the camel, why wasn't the bigger, stronger, faster zebra ever domesticated by prehistoric Africans? Wouldn't a local animal perfectly adapted to the environment and resistant to the local disease be the obvious choice? Yes, it would be obvious to the untrained eye. However, there are a few major obstacles that are usually overlooked. First, the obvious one. The native range of the zebra is well outside of West Africa, meaning that if the large cavalry-based empires of the West African savanna even had the will to domesticate zebras, they'd still have to have them imported from far-off lands, as zebras only inhabit parts of eastern and southern Africa. And even if they did naturally inhabit West Africa, we still run into problems. If we look back at the 5 traits that we discussed earlier in the video that make animals better candidates for domestication, we see that zebras don't fit too well into any of these. Despite similar physical attributes to horses, zebras are very, very, very wild. Their fight and flight instincts are an insurmountable obstacle that would have prevented domestication entirely. And I know what you're thinking, all animals start off wild, but can be tamed and eventually become domesticated over many generations. However, all candidates for domestication need to have at least somewhat of a calm temperament. Cats, for example, differ very little from their wild counterparts because they are nearly perfect for domestication already. They check most, if not all, of the 5 boxes that we covered earlier. They are small and easy to control, they naturally have a fairly reasonable tolerance of human presence, they breed very quickly, and most importantly, they directly benefit human beings. In fact, humans and cats shared a nearly symbiotic relationship for thousands of years. When prehistoric humans of Mesopotamia first began farming, they experienced a population explosion due to the resulting food surplus. However, this massive food surplus usually kept in grain bins, as well as the population explosion and the resulting unsanitary conditions brought about many pests, notably mice, rats, bugs, and birds, all of which are conveniently on the dinner menu of the African wildcat. So in a natural chain reaction, cats began to hang around human settlements, those that already possessed a fair tolerance to human presence, and in doing so, guaranteeing themselves an endless supply of critters to feed on. Over time, these creatures became tame and eventually domesticated, and in fact, it's believed that cats may have technically domesticated themselves rather than being captured and tamed initially by humans, as was the case with other animals such as cattle and chickens. It's also believed that a separate, independent event occurred in Africa where deliberate cat keeping developed in ancient Egypt, and we can credit them with truly domesticating the cat into the adorable and lovable creatures that we allow to inhabit our homes to this day, including the royal panther Ono. Not all animals are so agreeable, however. The donkey that we mentioned before is a prime example of this. When it comes to fight or flight, donkeys are definitely all fight and no flight, like many other African animals. A direct response to the wide plethora of predators that inhabit the continent, as well as millions of years of evolution alongside human beings and our hominid ancestors. Contrary to horses and zebras, donkeys evolved their unique behaviors and physical features in response to the arid climates where living in herds would have quickly exhausted all available resources. In addition to this, donkeys are very small compared to horses or zebras, require relatively little water, and live solitary lives, and instead of fleeing from danger, they confidently investigate and display extreme aggression with powerful bites and kicks if threatened. This extreme aggression coupled with innate territorial tendencies is precisely one of the qualities that make them so desirable, as they did not flee from early humans, and today they are intentionally kept in enclosures alongside goats, sheep, and other livestock to protect them from predators. Sometimes this behavior even becomes too much for their owners, and is exactly why we use words like ass or jackass to describe an insufferable person. So if horses are the gentle giants and donkeys are the literal asses, then what does that make zebras? Well, it makes them even bigger asses, both literally and figuratively speaking. They are bigger and stronger than donkeys, while also being much more mean and aggressive, thus very dangerous around human beings. So dangerous, in fact, that they are responsible for more injuries to humans at zoos than any other animal. Zebras are widely considered to be the bullies of zoos to both animals and zookeepers alike, as they are naturally very paranoid, anxious, skittish, and aggressive animals that scare easily and are ready to fight when even slightly provoked. Unlike horses and donkeys, they don't just fight to defend themselves from danger, they fight to kill, and they do not stop fighting until they have successfully done so. For example, rather than one simple bite or kick, they will latch on with their teeth and never let go. They will kick and trample non-stop, even if the threat is no longer attacking, and they have been observed breaking the jaws of lions, latching on with their teeth and holding them underwater to drown them, and even killing harmless herbivores that just so happen to have the misfortune of standing a little too close for comfort. Most people know not to stand behind horses, but zebras are so wild and so unpredictable that standing anywhere even near them is dangerous. Like, how dare you exist? Though wild horses and donkeys are also aggressive, they pale in comparison to the zebra. In the years following the colonization of Africa by Europeans throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, they learned this fact the hard way. During this era, when Europeans viewed themselves as superior to all other races of man, they saw these wild, striped horses roaming the plains of eastern and southern Africa, and they assumed that Africans simply lacked the ingenuity, creativity, or cognitive capacity to domesticate their own local animals, and opted to simply borrow animals from other parts of the world that had already been domesticated for thousands of years. Despite the fact that donkeys are close cousins to zebras and horses, it was not known definitively at this time that they were first domesticated in Africa until a full century later. In any case, Europeans, particularly the Germans and the Dutch, attempted to tame and potentially domesticate these wild horse-like beasts. Their primary motive was to find a local alternative to the horse, as their own horses would die as a result of the aforementioned African trypanosomiasis disease carried by the tsetse fly, endemic to most parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Also, as mentioned before, while some parts of sub-Saharan Africa did have horses of their own, particularly the grassy regions that were relatively safe from the forest-dwelling tsetse fly, they were expensive to import and maintain. Zebras, on the other hand, were abundant and in some cases a nuisance, so much so that some species were hunted to extinction, like the South African quagga, which was killed off by the late 19th century. It was viewed as a pest since it fed on the same pastureland as cattle and sheep of the locals. However, most of South Africa was below the tsetse fly belt, and thus imported horses could thrive without much issue. Elsewhere in Africa, however, zebras reigned supreme as they are resistant to the tsetse fly. In fact, scientists believe that their famous stripes are precisely why, as flies are attracted to large, dark, moving objects that create a solid color contrast from the surrounding area. The stripes of the zebra confuse and deter them from landing and biting. Despite these physical advantages in the African environment, European attempts at taming these savage beasts were largely unsuccessful. While some zebras were able to be tamed, their status never rose to anything more than novelties and curiosities, usually for circuses and zoos, or for some wealthy European men to pompously show off their wealth or horsemanship. While temperaments can vary between individual animals, including horses, zebras were generally far too aggressive and skittish to safely be kept in proximity to humans or even other animals without grave risk of injury, making the entire endeavor simply just not worth it in the long term. Among the most famous examples of this is from the 19th century, when Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild used his immense wealth to import exotic animals including zebras. He was desperate to prove to British society that zebras were in fact tameable. While he did succeed in training them to use a harness and to pull a carriage, they were impossibly skittish and aggressive without a guide horse. This 4-zebra carriage actually consisted of 3 zebras and 1 horse, which he disguised, literally a pony with stripes painted on. Because zebras and horses are both herd animals, it's easier to keep them calm if their leader is also calm, and since horses are significantly less skittish than zebras, this horse in disguise was critical. Despite his efforts, by the late 1890s he abandoned all attempts to tame them, claiming that they were far too aggressive and skittish, and that was simply not practical to parade them around the city because they posed far too much danger to surrounding people and property. He demonstrated that while it was possible to train them, they were far too aggressive and unpredictable to be trusted. It is also worth noting that the zebra itself was named after an ancient European wild ass, native to the Iberian Peninsula. This wild ass, known as the zebro, was also never domesticated and was consistently recorded in medieval European writings as an aggressive and virtually untamable beast, and as a result, it was exclusively hunted as a game animal until it went extinct sometime in the 16th century. In other words, sub-Saharan Africans managed to domesticate the highly aggressive African species long before horses were domesticated in Eurasia, all the while Europeans failed to tame their own on the grounds of aggression. The exact same obstacle that made the African zebra untamable. Zebras also have far less stamina and a fundamentally different spinal structure than horses, which effectively gives them a weaker and less stable back to ride on. riding zebras long term has been shown to result in back problems for the animals. In addition to all of these challenges, these attempts by European colonists largely took place around the same time as the earliest motor cars were being invented, which in turn reduced the need for horses or any kind of beast of burden, which made all the time, money, or investment in doing so less lucrative. So, with all that being said, could African people have domesticated the zebra? Well, given enough time, patience, resources, and consistent effort, it may very well have been possible over several centuries or millennia, but it simply just wasn't worth it. The risks to human life and safety greatly outweighed the benefits, even for 19th century industrializing Europeans, and especially when there were better alternatives like the donkey or the horse. In closing, I'd like to discuss one more situation in which two closely related animals display incredibly different behaviors. If you recall earlier in this discussion, I used the African wildcat as an example of a domesticated animal, the animal that would eventually become the common house cat. Europe also has its own native species of cat, very similar in appearance to the African wildcat. However, because of their intense territorial, aggressive, solitary, and skittish instincts, they were never domesticated, and it is widely accepted by scientists that they are impossible to domesticate. These behaviors are hardwired into their instincts in much the same way as they are in zebras. Attempts have been made in the past, but European wildcats simply cannot develop the levels of trust or calm demeanor of African wildcats, even after being raised in captivity from birth. Modern genetic testing conducted on house cats from all around the world have firmly concluded that all house cats today descend from the African variety, as opposed to the European species. Meanwhile, some African societies successfully tamed a much larger and more dangerous cat, the leopard, the Kingdom of Benin being among the most well-known examples of this. With that in mind, any sort of scrutiny for African societies for failing to tame the zebra while choosing to import foreign horses instead should be met with two key realities. The first one being that the donkey was domesticated in sub-Saharan Africa by sub-Saharan Africans, but the European wild ass was not. This also happened long before the horse was even domesticated at all in Eurasia. The other reality is that the European wildcat example that we just discussed is the exact same situation, yet we cannot logically claim that Europeans simply lack the ingenuity or intelligence to do so. Conclusions should never be based entirely on some old black and white photos of three zebras and a painted horse, and just because animals look alike does not mean that they are alike. If that was the case, then we'd be living among chimpanzees and gorillas. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications. For sources, check out my website, fromnothing.info. If you'd like to support the channel, join the community Discord server, explore products or Patreon, or make a video request of your own, you can do so there as well, or by checking my link tree down below. Thanks for watching, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.